published this book, How to Have an Enemy, Righteous Anger in the Work of Peace, and I suspect that's part of the reason I was asked to come here and speak to you today. I remember the moment that this book formed in my mind as something that I felt like had to be written for me to be whole. My daughter came home from kindergarten the night of November 4th, 2016. My children attend a Title I school that's both economically depressed and racially diverse. And one of her best friends, my child's best friends, is an undocumented Latinx child named Monzi. They lived in this sizable Mexican community right around the corner from our house. As a neighborhood, a diverse neighborhood, we had lived with the realities of the Trump campaign's vitriol towards the Mexican community. It was not lost on our neighbors, and it was not lost on our children. For weeks leading up to the election, my child asked me, what would happen to Monzi if Trump was elected? What would happen to their parents if they were deported? What if no one came to pick them up from school? But on the night of November 4th, my daughter shared with me a rumor that had been circulating among the kindergartners. That day, a regular delivery of cleaning supplies had shown up in the gym area. It was just boxes. But the rumor was going around that once the children of undocumented parents were deported, these were the boxes of school supplies that would be sent to Central America and Mexico for those children to continue school. That's a lot for 5-year-olds to process. And in that moment, I needed a community of solidarity and refuge. I needed the church to be angry, to bring forth this burning clarification. I wanted a reckoning among followers of Jesus that would propel us towards collective action and resistance to this. The stakes were so clear. They were born in the body of this 5-year-old child. They were before my community in these traumatized people. Some people did act and mobilize. Churches were called to action. But I also encountered pleas for conversation and understanding of both sides. I heard laments for division in the church. The real enemy, I was told, was polarization, families being torn apart by politics, churches divided over ideology. I don't want to dismiss the reality of the anguish that has happened over the past 2 years. I know family members who no longer speak to one another. I know churches that are battlegrounds. I don't want us to look away from that. I want us to sit with it today. Because this is where we begin, with an accurate and truthful description of our world. I think we all sense this kind of upheaval and internal complication when we witness loved ones, our church people, our teachers, our friends participating in forms of political life that are at odds with our perception of who they are, right? That's what happened. But that also misidentifies the problem. It isn't unusual for me to hear that polarization is the most vexing problem facing our churches, and this most often happens in majority white churches. But I want to remind you that we have been offered a gift of clarification. All of the stuff we kept below the surface, all the stuff that we didn't feel like we could say aloud because it wasn't polite or acceptable, it is now before us. We have been offered a stunning kind of clarification about how we think of the world, about race, about our participation in the political systems of our day. Polarization, at its most basic form, is dividing up two groups around two particular forms of life or identities or ideologies. Polarization occurs around questions, issues, and actions that matter deeply for our identity.
I don't know about you, but I have never read a headline announcing deep division over federal banking regulation or net neutrality is tearing families apart. Right? Those are significant issues, very, very significant issues for our everyday lives, but they don't polarize. Polarization comes when people at the margins of power demand access to the rights and privileges held and guarded by the majority. That's when polarization happens in the United States. The most polarizing era in the United States was the Civil War, followed by the modern civil rights movement, then the queer liberation movement, the movements for reproductive justice, for Black lives. These are the moments when identity, power, race, gender, sexuality have called us into solidarity, and they're moments that have evoked in us a crisis. And if you're a person of faith, you should be sensing some resonance here, because we follow after a Jesus who frequently enacts polarization in his community. You're probably all familiar with the words of the Gospel of Luke. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who weep. But the Gospel of Matthew goes on. Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Poor and rich, hungry and full, weeping and laughing, reviled and respected, Jesus evokes a crisis. The categories and hierarchies of power and status that his listeners use to divide up their world, those are fictions. Instead, the primary division that matters to God is economic. Those who have much and those who have nothing. And these moments of crisis are meant to call us to recognition. We shift from our own political descriptors and now plot ourselves along the line that Jesus draws. And then we rationalize our position. We negotiate our place. We excuse ourselves. We allegorize the content of this passage until it is no more. And all along there, Jesus is burning on the page. Blessed are the poor. Woe to you who are rich. Jesus' intention in provoking this crisis is to point to the place where we are intended to live in unity. We are led back to unity and solidarity around the most vulnerable of our world. It's a crisis that is also an invitation. Last year, one of my alma maters organized a convocation entitled Uncommon Ground, Living with Humility, Patience, and Tolerance in a Divided Age. I have no doubt my university was responding to these massive breaks that have developed during the Trump administration and were exacerbated during COVID-19. But there's an assumption in conferences like these, in sermon series about unity, and books written to help pastors through times of division. The assumption is that our divisions are not as significant as how we handle them. The real problem in our time is not the death of Black and brown people at the hands of police. It isn't the denial of climate catastrophe. It isn't an economy built on the backs of low-wage workers and undocumentable people. The problem is division, one that can be addressed with humility, patience, and tolerance. Instead, in the words of Leonardo Boff, in the Bible, we meet a Jesus who provoked a crisis that brought about a rupturing decision for him. How will we respond? It would be a profound loss to cede this crisis to fictive political markers that attempt to organize our differences around ideology. Partisanship is a convenient scapegoat for conflict. I appreciate this assessment from the theologian Willie Jennings, who reminds us these categories of left and right have never really done any analytical work in the United States. He says their work is profoundly novelistic. They plot individuals and groups and narratives that minimize or dismiss the importance of their specific ideas. And these divisions are often sites of deception for the church. I'll give you one example of that, of this political fiction, is in the bipartisan response to refugee resettlement. After promising an end to historically low levels of refugee resettlement under the Trump administration, Joe Biden walked back his promise after his election to the presidency. In a stunning reversal, Biden announced he would keep the cap at 15,000 refugees, even as the number of people displaced by war and famine and political persecution soared around our world. In the debate over immigration and refugee resettlement, we are lured into accepting assumptions about the right of a particular resources, about the political risks that come from inflaming white identity politics. In accepting the parameters of this conversation, we are shaped by them. They inhibit our imaginations and dampen our resistance to the very order of this narrative. I'd like to return us to Scripture, a passage I preached on a few weeks ago that caught my eye. It's from Isaiah 16, where God is weeping. But God is not weeping over God's chosen people, Israel. God is weeping over the Moabites who have been displaced by war. I weep with the weeping of Jazer from the vines of Sibmah. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Eleal. For the shout over your fruit harvest and your grain harvest has ceased. This section ends with these words spoken by God. Therefore, my heart throbs like a heart for Moab. The Moabites are the ones who invoke God's grief. Moab is beloved as one of God's creatures, and God is grief-stricken at their displacement, at the brutal destruction of their lands. God's sorrow and God's tears are an invitation for us to get caught up in that life, in God's life. Once we respond to the crisis that God invokes, we find ourselves unencumbered by the parameters of neoliberal economics that animate our immigration debate. We, in turn, are called to more imaginative and more insistent resistance. So it is unfathomable for Christians to hold to immigration politics rooted in the fears of racial animosity and the loss of white majority power. Lifting the cap on refugee resettlement is only a fraction of what is required of us by our faith in Jesus Christ. We're to call into question the very logic at the center of this debate. A few years ago, my friend Isaac was arrested in the parking lot of our local immigration office. He'd come to support Samuel Oliver Bruno, a man living in sanctuary at a local Methodist church in North Carolina. Samuel had been threatened with deportation and decided to continue to fight his case living in sanctuary. ICE lured Samuel out of hiding with a promise that he was going in for a routine background check, part of his immigration process. Instead, as soon as he entered the building, ICE agents pounced on him and dragged him to a van out behind the building. It was there that Isaac and 26 other people from our community surrounded that vehicle. They refused to let ICE drive away with their friend inside. They stood around the van until the police arrived and pulled them apart one by one, arresting them for obstructing justice. That Sunday, Isaac preached about what happened. We can't separate our lives, and we can't separate our belief in God from our lives of justice towards our neighbor, he explained. We can't separate our love of God from our love of God's children. Our lives are our confession of faith. We write statements of belief with our bodies, with our actions, and our love for one another. We worship God with our daily ethics. There's no place where worship ends and our lives begin. Our lives, the fullness of them, are a testimony to what we actually believe about Jesus Christ. And if we actually believe that Jesus is Lord, then that will threaten the structured violence that we call the principalities and powers that animate our social order. We will join our lives to God's tears, and we will become God's weeping for all of those who are displaced by climate catastrophe and war and famine. When this happens, we'll discover with Herbert McCabe that Christianity is not an ideal, it's a praxis, a particular kind of challenge to the world. This is the reason that Jesus' presence, his crisis-provoking presence, introduced conflict and division everywhere he went. Jesus shook foundations that we took for granted. He removes the load-bearing beams from economic and social engines and watches the building sway. I often find in my own tradition, the Mennonite Church, people like to describe our work as the work of shalom. And by this we mean decelerating conflict and constructing spaces for interpersonal communication and building avenues for repair. We place significant hope in our ability to build bridges and provide space for enemies to become friends. In the past decades, we've seen this shalom theology blossom from non-resistance to active, engaged, righteous justice. The works of Perry Yoder and Willard Swartley have propelled us in this direction. Following these monumental shifts from non-resistance to nonviolence, we are facing new challenges as a church. We are asked once again to reinterpret our peace tradition for the challenges before us. And I'd like to share a story that's at the heart of that challenge. In 2016, Akiel Dinkins was shot in the back 4 times while running from the police. The police claim Dinkins was shot in the back because he had a gun, a reminder that North Carolina is an open carry state. Our community was already tense and on edge following the police shooting deaths of Philando Castile and Alton Brown, and when Akiel was killed by police, the Raleigh Police Department could sense the outrage and tension growing in our streets. They knew that the protests could turn towards property damage and intensify clashes with police on the streets. They wanted to avoid that, and so they called in the clergy. The chief of police gathered a room full of the most influential mainline, progressive, and Black church pastors in the city. She asked for their support to bring peace to the community. The police are peacekeepers, she told them, and the clergy could support the peace by helping the police. And so they came up with a plan. And then one of the pastors asked if they could pray, and they lay hands of blessing on the chief. That afternoon, youth from 2 different groups in our neighborhood got together to plan a march for Akiel. I wouldn't go as far as to call these 2 groups gangs, but they were bitter and often violent rivals. But on this day, they decided they would put aside their differences. The police were killing Black and brown people in our community. There was no accountability, no change to the system, no reckoning. And they were from Akiel's neighborhood. They knew how white flight had pushed people out of this neighborhood in the 90s, draining it of resources. They live in the middle of food apartheid with no grocery store for miles. And now gentrification was turning that all around. Now rising home prices were pushing them out of their neighborhoods. Their communities and schools were over-policed to keep these new wealthy white arrivals comfortable. And so these youth planned this march for Akiel. It wove through the neighborhoods of Southeast Raleigh. It was supposed to end at the police station, where there would be a protest. But up ahead, they saw a line of pastors. As they approached, the clergy took over the march, directing the marchers away from police headquarters and back into the neighborhoods where everyone had dispersed, just as the chief of police had requested. Over the coming months, the Raleigh Police Department did everything in its power. It worked through every channel available to counter attempts of Akiel Dinkin's mother, Rolanda Bird, to establish a citizen-led police board. The police union lobbied hard to restrict public access to body cam footage and other measures to restrict excessive force. In the Mennonite Church, we often talk about following the third way of Jesus. This language is rooted in our ecclesial identity. We're neither Catholic or Protestant, but it extends into other areas of life. It is morphed into not being a Democrat or Republican, neither left or right. I've heard people from my tradition talk with pride about how they are too conservative for liberals and too liberal for conservatives. There's some truth to this. The Jesus we follow does not chart a course that is often recognizable to those around him. People are consistently baffled by his refusal to align with either the Zealots or the Pharisees or the Essenes. Jesus discomforts many assumptions about social order. The responses range from befuddlement to attempting to throw him off a cliff. But where we get into trouble is at the point where we trust our ability to hold on to a position of Jesus when we make it another way among ways. We, 2,000 plus years after Jesus lived on this earth, often act as if we are in the work of solidifying a particular set of principles or actions or values, when the Christian life is one about being confronted by the power of a living God. We are not inheritors of a particular set of principles we can replicate in every age. We are disciples, baffled and upended when the Word of God touches down in the real mess of our lives. I've also begun to wonder if the language of a third way places us in competitive relationships with the work that God is doing in all parts of creation. Our ability to decipher where God is acting is more often than not our belief that God is acting where we think God ought to act. God must be here among the police because they use the language of peace, when instead the police have simply empowered the church to act as their agents to quell resistance. We spend quite a bit of time setting up competitions for a God who is not in competition with anyone or anything. When we speak of the lordship of Jesus Christ, we mean the consistent disruption of our settled tactics and our ingrained assumptions. We are invited to invite others into this disruption, to recalibrate from this destabilizing force of a living God, to listen carefully as the Holy Spirit reveals herself among us. There is an acute danger to distilling the earth-shattering life of Jesus down to values. Yet I often find myself in Peace Church communities attempting this distillation. If everyone is mad at you, then you know you're doing the right thing. Have you heard that one before? If you listen to both sides and keep seeking understanding, then you're about the work of Jesus' peace. If you refuse to engage in any political systems, you are following Jesus. But Jesus escapes. As it turns out, Jesus doesn't need a revolution because the reign of God has come. Jesus doesn't need a sword because his life is the life of God, multiplying in the good news of those around him. Jesus doesn't want one regime swapped out for another because Jesus puts an end to the cycles of empire that rise and fall. Have you noticed what Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Plain? Love your enemies and do good to them, and lend to them without expecting anything in return. He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Did you catch that? Kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. That seems to stand in contrast to what we heard earlier, the woe to you who are rich. That does not sound very gracious. But I think Perhaps another translation of this word is better. God is better to them than they are to themselves. And that's because the blessings and woes of the Beatitudes are descriptions of a way of life. Jesus describes a kind of life we have already chosen. Because a life where we are full and others are hungry is actually a bad life. A life where others weep and we laugh, that's a bad life. A life where others are persecuted and harmed and bullied while we're respected, that's a bad life. Polarization is born of a crisis of identity, and it can create community. People, diverse and complicated and different, gather into groups who work towards a new world. We organize and activate, we resist and build new communities. And because we're people, we mess up. And because we're made of people, we get things wrong. Often in activist community, we witness the harm we try to resist actually replicating itself inside of us. And that harm can sometimes take the form of something called cancel culture. I'm guessing many of us know the term cancel culture from politicians on the right. Josh Hawley is one of the main politicians who's offered his condemnation of cancel culture. He wants permission to distort facts, to have free range for speech that is racist and violent and anti-Semitic, where there is no consequences or accountability. Attempts to restrict this so-called freedom are labeled cancel culture. And you may be surprised to hear that activists on the left are also concerned about cancel culture. But perhaps we're using the phrase differently. My concern is not to blow up the Overton window so that we are constantly bombarded by hate speech. My concern comes from a different direction, and it's rooted in the work of abolitionism. One of the commitments of abolitionists is that we can only create a kind of world that no longer requires prisons if we are able to produce that world among us, among people who are committed to that vision. Abolitionists want a world where we are responsible for addressing harm as communities, where we enact transformative justice and accountability among us. If we can't enact transformative justice in our community, how can we expect others to take hold of this vision? If we can't live it out here, how do we live it out there? As it is repairing harm when it occurs in abolitionist communities, because it does all the time, again, because they're made of people, repairing this harm requires much more work than conflict reduction and understanding both sides of an argument. It requires a better imagination than destroying one another in public. Adrienne Marie Brown offers this caution. As attacks grow faster and more vicious, I wonder, is this what we're here for? To cultivate a fear-based adherence to reductive common values? What can this lead to in an imperfect world full of sloppy, complex human beings? Is it possible we'll call each other out until there's no one left beside us? So instead, we ask a question. What is the world we want? Not just for others, but for us. I want a world where no one is disposable. I want a world where we are able to repair harm without resorting to punishment or relying on state intervention. I want us to recognize within ourselves that there is no real innocence and no real evil, that we exist in complicating, intersecting narratives of identity and trauma and promise. We believe that this is not an excuse or reason that we deny or obfuscate harm. Instead, it's the basis for assessing how we make paths for return from one another. The goal of abolition is to heal the ruptures of harm without punishment and isolation. And cancel culture, call-out culture, it negates this possibility. If we're going to build institutions that give life, we have to commit to building that life-giving here and the people that are doing the work alongside of us. That can't happen if we continue to prize the end of interpersonal conflict over justice that transforms us. When we settle for bland centrism and both-sidism, we are actually depriving those engaged in harm, abuse, and destruction the opportunity for return. On the other side, when we shut ourselves off from repair, we lose the ability to grow and change and become whole. Sometimes we need to be called out. Pointing out someone's harm in a pointed, succinct way, sometimes that is necessary, but not all the time and not for everything. We can have better discernment about the disruptions happening in our communities. And that means forming the kind of communities where curiosity can thrive. This means creating communities that can trust one another with our failures because we've shown that we are willing to show up over and over again in the real material situations that we all face. Many of us in the organizing community have shifted from this language of call-outs to call-ins, which I know is a little precious, but it is what it is. But call-ins invite people in our communities who've done harm, who are involved in harmful politics and beliefs, to get involved in new kinds of work, to join in the work of liberation erupting around us. Call-ins are another tool, another way to open the door to life-giving politics. And friends, that's a gift that everybody needs. Every one of us. Because you're going to mess up. People mess up. No one can stay pure in the difficult, intense work of shifting an entire culture towards wholeness. We'll get it wrong, we'll hurt, we'll harm. But we can grow and return because we have communities that can receive us back, who can invite us to look clearly at what happened and then turn our lives back towards one another. In the church, we call this grace. We're living in a time where we need discernment and community more than ever. We need to live into the complexity and hardness of these times without ignoring or excusing abuse and harm that's happening around us. We need places that cultivate for us, thriving and places to grow, places to heal, and places to resist. This is the work that is for us today. In times of deep polarization, as we're facing conflicts in our families, and our friends, and our classrooms, and our churches. It's hard work, but it's the work we've been given to do.
Well, thanks so much for sharing with us. As is our custom, we have some time for questions now, and I'll give you a minute or two to turn to your neighbor and have a brief conversation about what you might want to ask, and then we'll come back together and have question time. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Interesting to see where this goes.
Yeah.
All right, I'd like to call us back together again, and we have a number of minutes here to have some question time. Gerald Mast has a microphone, so I'd ask you to get his attention and ask your question in the microphone, and we'll let you proceed.
I think the handheld mic is off. He's checking on it.
Testing.
There you go.
Yep. All right. When you talked about polarization and like in the community, do you believe that only people in power can make that happen, or do you believe like as a community and the way we live, that can happen?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that polarization is almost entirely about power, right? And yeah, sort of back to that example, the things that we don't polarize around, even though they're really significant to our lives, polarization almost entirely happens in the U.S. around questions of identity, racial identity, gendered identity, sexual identity. And so I do think, I mean, obviously that can happen in a lot of places, right? We see people split over things, but I do think that there can be, sometimes we use a couple different terms to name the same different things that are happening, right? Polarization is not really the same as just having conflicts in the community, right? Which is different than animosity, which is, right? But having two groups that are split ideologically over a decision, you need power to make that happen. I hope that speaks to that a little bit.
Good question. Now's the time for people around here.
Thank you so much. My imagination is firing about your statement that the Christian life is not just about distilling certain values and sticking to them and promoting them, but it's a consistent encounter of the inbreaking of God in the world and being challenged by that. I might have not summed it up quite right. But at Bluffton, we have 4 enduring values, and all of our students have heard about them, right? Discovery, respect, service, and community. And so what do we do? Like, how do we, as an institution, as a Mennonite institution of higher learning, what do we do with our values that are a part of our 100-plus year tradition? And how do we activate them so they're not just sort of standing in for real encounters with God on our campus? What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think part of that's, I mean, my kids go to school where there are 7 values. We have more values than you. Yeah, and they're really helpful for, like, to organize. Craftsmanship would be one of them. And it's really helpful for organizing yourself. But I also think, different kinds of institutions have different things, right? This is a university, it's not a church. Right, and so it's which is I think it's just a different mission. So I think it's great to keep your values. What I think is that story from Achiel Dinkins demonstrates is that if we have aligned peacemaking with, just as long as property never gets damaged, like what mean is we just don't want property to get damaged. We don't really want to have any confrontations with the police. If we've reduced peacemaking to that, which we are in deep danger of in the Mennonite Church, then we need an encounter with the living God.
Thanks for what you shared this morning. I was intrigued by when you talked about cancel culture and calling people out. You encouraged us to start calling in. And can you say more about what you mean by that? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I'll just give an example of this. There was some work that is being done to move towards having an alternative 911 operational number that is for mental health crisis. So that you can have a mental health responder rather than an armed police officer. 75% of Black people who were killed in police encounters last year had a mental illness. We just had someone die after being a traumatic brain injury in a car accident. Looked like he was threatening a police officer and he was shot to death. Those are all places that do not need a armed police response. Which is about 90% of police calls. Somebody in our community had gone directly to the chief of police and had began trying to basically work an alternative channel that diluted that work and called some of the kind of basis of it into question, sort of just going off on his own. Good heart, right? Not somebody who's an adversary, but he needed to be a part of the work that was already going on. And so you could have put him on blast on Twitter, right? Like, this guy is like a traitor, and instead they had a conversation with him and said, hey, that does not align with the kind of work that we're doing, which needs to be led by the community, not by individuals. This is the process we're a part of. We want you to be a part of it. And that person can choose to do that or not. But that's an invitation to say, hey, this isn't the way that we're going to do this work. This is not a healthy way to do this as a Lone Ranger. But we've already got this thing happening here. Why don't you join us? Well, since I'll just also mention, I want to cancel people all the time. Like, I do not have a pure heart about this. I want to punish people and isolate them, like bad people, right? Like, I want to do that. I want them to hurt. That is a deep, deep root in me to feel that I am constantly excavating. Because I love Jesus. No. But just don't think that this comes naturally to me. It does not. I don't like any of this, but it's just the way it is. All right, you guys are ready to go. All right.
Well, thanks so much for sharing with us. We appreciate your being here. You're dismissed.